Thank you for two wonderful presentations. We have a few minutes for questions from the floor. We have microphones on both aisles, so please come to the microphones and ask your clear and concise question to our presenters.
For all of you, what would you tell someone that I'm thinking about who works in the advertising industry about how images could be used in Christian ways?
What a great question.
Go for it.
I have a friend who came to our career night who is a very successful agent in the advertising industry. And he talked about being in the, 80th floor of Manhattan and looking a CEO dead in the eye and saying, "You're afraid." And all of her employees breathing this huge sigh of relief. Finally, somebody could say it to her. He had the boldness. He used to be a church planter for the Vineyard. I'm amazed at the people who do that. And I look at his clientele, and honestly, there are sometimes I'm like, oh man. But other times where he's choosing, because he has attained that status, he's choosing to selectively and very appropriately make those decisions. But it's not easy. And so I would tell them to be very, very careful. But also to be salt and light. Such a good question. That's the one that hovers in my mind.
You know, if I could engage in that as well, I would say to be ready to be surprised by the Spirit. There is no place in this world where the Spirit of God is barred.
Amen.
And I think about actually a friend of mine who is a style blogger. When she first got into the style blogging world, I felt like she was speaking a different language. And to become a successful blogger, you have to constantly be self-promoting and using images in ways that make me as a Christian really uncomfortable. And over the last couple of years, the Spirit of God has been doing a new work in her life. And she's been very convicted by that and the way that she uses her voice and power in that world. And it's been incredible to see the transformation that's taken place as she's being very aware of how she uses her voice in the style blogging world. I think that it's not bad that marketers recognize that we are desiring beings. In some ways, it's really against the church that we haven't understood that, right? Marketers have gotten it that we are desiring beings, and that's not a bad thing. But what are we directing those desires toward, I guess would be the question that I would ask your friend in the marketing world.
And then one last word, since you asked all three of us. Christian education is interesting because I'm a product of Christian education, Christian higher ed, worked in it for years. I was a student at a Christian university a lot like this. And one of the things that I was told over and over again is that this is what makes a Christian university distinct, is that we teach a kind of education here that is Christian. So I always wondered, what does that mean? And so in the last few years, I've just been asking myself, what does Christian math look like? If you get a different answer to a Christian math problem, it's time to re-examine your math, right? I don't trust the engineer who's going to do Christian engineering to build a bridge, because it's going to be somehow different. But the outcomes in terms of formation of desire are totally different. So what do you do to form a desire within a mathematician, a young math major in their sophomore year, to form their imagination and their desires in such a way that they are God-directed, so that you're not getting different answers to math problems, but you're directing those to different ends. And so the Addams family, I think, is doing a pretty good job of that, in terms of directing those desires toward different ends.
Hi there, Dr. Milliner. Thank you for your talk. It was mostly over my head, which is part of where my question comes from. And that is that if we're, at least me, I am a artistically illiterate person. And so me encountering a lot of those images, if I were to come to them and see them without your mediation and your interpretation of them, they would be wholly lost on me. And so my question would be, in this project, in this really discipleship of learning to have our images broken, how do we in the church, deal with pervasive artistic illiteracy? of which I'm, I feel myself the foremost example. I'd much prefer the words, frankly. And so could you maybe speak a bit to that?
The history of art. That's the answer. No. But, I think that is a really important question. In some senses, what I meant by that beginning morphing of art history into visual culture, it's kind of this discipline saying, whoa, we have this charism for this time that we've got to employ, and we have to stop being the dusty connoisseurs. Let's engage what's going on. And so the question that you just asked is one that's in the process. There's this mutation that's going on. But I think Alul gets it. And I think the quickest thing I could say is pick up that book, Humiliation of the Word. And he goes a little bit too far in his negative assessment of all images. But he really does understand that the words can really have this job of neutralizing, almost like water on the Wicked Witch, right? And not all images need to be neutralized. Some need to be aggrandized. That's why I concluded with those wonderful images from our department. But that's one thing, is to realize that your mystification in front of images in an art museum, for example, is the requirement for words to come alongside of them and assist you in that. And there's a lot of good art history written, and not a lot of it is read. And so one of the important jobs, and really a simple tip, if I may be so bold, I used to be too cool for the audio guide, right? Take it. You're getting the curator talking to you about the images. Those really can be helpful. And so faced with that bafflement, just continually bring the best resources along to use your scalpel of verbiage to better frame the given image that you're engaging. I hope that helps. Sure.
Thanks to all of you for your presentation, opening new areas of thought for me. I have 3 sons and a daughter, who actually goes here, my daughter. And I was a teenager in the midst of the Y-Wait campaign. I think I was probably the early part. And I remember being appreciating it in part, but feeling kind of like a wound was opened and kind of left gaping by it. In your statement, we can't wait to be sexual, I guess particularly to the Gaines, but any of you can respond. Can you tease it out? Can you help me a little bit more with that? What does that mean for our children? Obviously, restraint, there's some place for restraint, but I do believe there's something, some sort of fulfillment.
Thank you for that. I was rushing towards the end there, trying to make sure that we gave Matt plenty of time because he had so much good stuff to share with us. We can't wait to be sexual because we are sexual because we're created in the image of God. That was not pertaining to the acts of sexual intercourse. So those are 2 separate things. I hope that distinction is clear. But that we are sexual beings is inherent to who we are. And so often in church life, we assume that is like an asexual realm, right? We walk in the doors and we cease to be sexual. The story that I dropped out from Jim Gaffigan, do you guys mind if I use this opportunity? Okay. Jim Gaffigan is a comedian. He has this great bit. He is Catholic, and he has this great bit about being in a Catholic church passing the peace. And he jokes about being sexually attracted to other women he's passing the peace to. I won't say what he says, but he jokes about passing the peace, being attracted to women in the congregation. But I think that really rings to this kind of deeper ache within us that we don't check our sexuality at the door when we enter the church. And there is a sense in which we need to pass the peace because we need to touch and be touched by one another. There needs to be a place in Christian worship where our sexuality can be more than orgasmic, where our sexuality can be the close intimacy that we share with one another in a physical way. We need churches to pass the peace and to take that seriously. We need to let young people engage their passions and desires. I love it when I hear young people that are absolutely desiring and passionate and enraged about justice issues and about poverty. We need to direct desires towards those things and not pretend like we don't have them and you just need to hold on to those and wait until you get married, because we have those no matter what. And so what are we directing those desires toward? I don't know where our friend went. Does that answer your question a little bit better? Good.
Can I throw in just
Yeah.
one of my favorite quotes if we discuss these issues? Simone Weil, to criticize the mystics for using erotic language to describe their relationship with God is like criticizing painters for using brushes.
Right.
It's the only language they have, but it's a chaste sexuality that you see in the great Christian mystics.
Dr. Milliner, thank you for your brilliance and sharing it with us. I have a question. When you have something like the Ishtar Gate, which is going to feature idol or idol imagery, and then you have something like George Frederick Watts, which is going to feature very similar idol imagery, when you don't have the handy cross on the forehead, how does one tell the difference? Is it all the artist's intention, or if we can just reinterpret them, then wouldn't that be the iconoclasm? We just look at them differently?
I think in a way that in regard to that other question, there's a sense in which words rhetorically can function as the cross. You don't have to, it was like a necessary literal moment, unfortunately. I hope we don't go into the museums and start doing that. But if you approach them critically using this skill of words, then you won't need to actually carve the crosses. And that's what good art history is for, which you are pursuing.
Hi, I have a question for the Gaines' presentation. I liked the way that you were trying to relocate some of the discussion with more explicit reference to what the incarnation might have to say. However, I'd like to push a bit on one point and just see how you might respond. So it seems that to make that theological move, you automatically encounter the problem with knowing how do we read off from Jesus' life what is actually true about my humanity. And it seems that at least some theologians read off that after the ascension, in some way there is a kind of desexualizedness to Christ's humanity. So then it's not immediately obvious just that because Christ came in flesh, he automatically baptized our sexual desires. So I'd be curious how you dealt with that tension, if you have any other evidence for why we should think that Jesus' human sexual desires are going to continue for us, and why not they might not, in a sense, go away in the eschaton.
So is your question, I'm just trying to understand it clearly here.
Yeah.
So in terms of the ascension, you're saying that some theologians argue there's an erasure of sexual desire, and that might be part of what the hope of Christian redemption or something along those lines. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right, yes.
And why that's not the case?
Right, so why wouldn't I think, for example, that the fact that Jesus has human desires is part of accommodation to redeeming this nature? So it's tricky, I think, to just read off exactly what of Jesus' human nature is the good parts and what are the parts that he's redeeming. So what is it in the future? What happens to our sexual desires is still unclear. And how do we know that those things continue?
Yeah, okay, I think I understand that.
Yeah.
Well, the incarnation itself, I mean, that's why it's so strange to Christianity. It's why I love it so much, is that it, like that which has not been assumed cannot be redeemed. And so I don't think there's anything that needs to be read off or written off about the incarnation. That the gospel writers seem to be very content with maintaining desire as being part of Jesus' human experience. That the way I read it, at least, the gospel writers did not write out desire. Jesus is fully desiring. Now, I included the part about John's resurrection narrative, Jesus desiring fish, because that's in the resurrection. Yeah. And so you have desire on both sides of the resurrection, before Jesus is crucified, and then you also have it in the resurrection itself. There's something just beautifully sacramental, too, about the fact that Jesus desires at the Lord's table, and that desire is immediately translated into kenotic giving. It's a beautiful sacramental image. And so I don't know that necessarily needs to be written off. I guess I would just speak back to some of those theologians who would say something about in the resurrection, or even in the ascension, that there is no sexuality, and just say, well, we need to read the Gospels. And, oh yes, the open wound. Okay, so like we're going to do a little more art here. The open wound in Jesus' side, I didn't get a chance to do this. Caravaggio has this incredible painting. It's really not biblically accurate, It's not, because in John's Gospel, chapter 20, I think, Jesus shows up and Thomas says, I will not believe until I place my hand in Jesus' side. And Jesus does show up and says, well, come do it. And Thomas doesn't. He believes. Caravaggio, however, has an image, and it's on one of the covers on one of the books back there. It's pretty fun, where Jesus is actually grabbing Thomas's hand and guiding Thomas's fingers into his side. Jesus is doing this. And so the wound from which Jesus' own life began to pour out canonically is now the point of entry into the divine life of God, into the place of redemption. And so, again, there's lots more to say here. Maybe we can, I don't know, meet up at dinner or something along those lines. But I would probably just speak back to the theologians who might argue that position and say, well, I don't know, that's not what I see in the kind of the canonic approach to the Gospels.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to land on pedagogy. I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'm going to say some things and ask you to respond in terms of how do we teach this effectively. So it seems like we're dancing with a number of iconoclasms. We're smashing the idol of sexuality as purely orgasmic and expanding the idea of what sex looks like. We're smashing, to a degree, we're smashing the idol of images. This is not a pipe. Our assumptions as we bring to images. But the third iconoclasm is the one that image does, which is the smashing of our trust in the security of words. How do we speak using words and present iconoclastic images? You see, it's kind of, there's a spinning kind of self-referential thing happening. So I'm a pastor. I'm a pastor in a traditional Protestant church that has no art whatsoever. It grieves me. It's about as much as what's on the walls here. I'm keen carefully to introduce the right kind of images to begin to adjust the thinking of my members. Right. You thought it was this, but it's this. You thought it was this, but it's this. Yeah. And to move beyond, we love that security, that safety net of just words, and moving beyond that. So that's the scenario, and I'm inviting you to speak pedagogically. How would you advise us to teach? And think practically. Think about people who don't know any of this stuff.
I love, do we have more pastors in here? Pastors came, wonderful, wonderful. It's so important the way that we engage our congregations to recognize whole desiring beings and whole desiring communities, right? That there is that kind of communal being as well. I loved actually to hear some of the work that Matt was talking about happening in local churches, working with local artists to be expressive in different ways. It's so important to connect the words that we're saying and preaching, the scripture that we're reading, with things that people can see and touch. In our congregation, Tim had mentioned that we preached through a series on the Song of Solomon. Tim suggested it, and he said, let's preach 8 weeks on the Song of Solomon. I said, let's preach 4, and we compromised at 4. And throughout that month, we were preaching on Sunday morning on Song of Solomon, and then on Sunday nights, we had these very different kinds of worship services that there were very little words. It was mostly music and images. There were interactive things for the congregation members to do, and very little was said. In fact, very little was said, which was nice on me as a pastor. But that was an important part of that. It wasn't just about the proclamation of the word standing alone in the sermon. There was this interplay between the two. When we preached a series on the wilderness motif throughout Scripture, we turned our sanctuary into a Bedouin tent, so that when people walked in, they felt as though they perhaps were some of the wanderers wandering through the desert, who had no fixed place to stay. So I think that kind of engagement, kind of creative engagement, is really helpful in helping people connect and giving maybe some legitimacy back to words, right? Maybe we need some more accountability with the words that we're saying in our congregations. I love that we began this morning with a poem, that in some ways those words took on so much more life because we didn't have to sit and parse them all out and say it wasn't a 4-part argument of whatever. They were just beautiful, and maybe our words need to be a bit more beautiful, and maybe our sanctuaries and worship spaces do as well.
I can only emphasize that even further, because our topics come together. The sanctuary should be a place of seeking communion with God. Other desires have now colonized the Church of the Holy Communion, and the ecstasy-laden desires during the club era was definitely intense desire as well. But the desire for God transcends all of those, and good and beautiful architecture and painting, elegantly done, is something that can stimulate that to the greatest desire of all. But it's such an important thing. You're asking practical questions. Commissions, speaking to the artists who have done it well, not finding someone who just, hey, do you paint a little bit? Yeah, experiment with me. No. You apprenticing yourself to church history to see the ways it's been done in the past. Google Art Project gives you this ridiculous wealth of images of great ones from church history. And I think that the iconic tradition especially, what's wonderful about icons is that people can do them without having the skill of Michelangelo, which is why he returned to icons at the end of his career. He wanted to humble himself underneath these simpler images. And so our Orthodox and Catholic brothers and sisters can help us, but so can some of the artists that are even in this room.
I might just say one last thing about the smashing of the word. And yeah, so did I. But I don't want to do that. Why? Because, well, word is important for the Christian tradition. But we also need to recognize, too, that word is spoken theologically on the back of breath. And so even at the formation of creation, the creative word that is spoken is on the breath of Ruach. Try to speak a word without breathing. It cannot be done. And so word and breath are intimately connected. So I don't want to smash words. I want to recover the spirit infilling of those words, if that makes sense.
We have very little time, but one more question.
Okay. As for the Gaineses, I understand the attempt for a positive, redemptive, sexual desire kind of thing going on in our communities. I'm a pastor, and so I understand that. I grew up with True Love Waits. I wore the I'm Not Doing It shirt, T-shirt to school. Wish that were a lie. No, seriously, Josh McDowell signed the back of it. So, and I'm a white Wheaton kid, so I lived through all that. While I understand that and I'm all for that, our staff does the half hug as a policy. But we live increasingly in a world where information is everywhere and people are telling their story online. And while I understand the positive redemptive motivation, what do we do when we're among people whose pains and hurts scream for the safety of don't touch me? What does that look like for you practically in your ministry?
What a humbling question. Thank you for that. We deal with whole persons. We minister with and among whole, storied persons. I think about a group of young girls that began coming to our congregation a couple of years ago from a foster care home. Their caregiver just began busing them to church on Sunday morning. Some of them did not want to be there. They came out of incredible brokenness, and they came dressed in ways that some of our congregation members felt was very inappropriate, and showing lots of skin, lots of #Christian cleavage. And it made some folks uncomfortable, and the way that we sort of well, first of all, humans are people are not problems, right? So the presence of these women in our congregation was not a problem, and we did not treat them as though their presence was problematic. Actually, what ended up kind of evolving from that was really neat. We got to have conversations with the people who had the problem with the way that they were dressed. And we also got to have some great conversations with young men in the congregation who were acting a bit inappropriately in their presence as well, to maybe get to the root of why we're so uncomfortable about some of these things. It's not because there's anything wrong with our bodies necessarily, but the way that we grasp at the image of those. And so we got to have some really healthy and fruitful conversations, but that happened over a long period of time, and at a lot of with a lot of patience and graciousness on the part of quite a few in our congregation. So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, other than we minister with and among whole and broken persons. And so I know that casting images on the screen like we did today of the Abercrombie Finch advertisements, probably not something you want to do on a Sunday morning. And people come into your sanctuaries with addictions. People come into your sanctuaries for whom images trigger serious mental disorders and brokenness, and we don't take that lightly. And yet I think that there are still ways to engage worshipfully in very embodied, physical, and erotic, I don't know of a better word to use, but erotic kind of worshipful experiences that are not aimed towards sex acts, that are not aimed towards orgasmic experiences and that kind of gratification, but that are really aimed towards offering our bodies, our whole selves up to the God that created us. I do believe there's still space for that.
I'll just say one quick theological thing about that, and that is in the incarnation, what we begin to see is Jesus' touch is redemptive. And so Jesus longs to touch Jerusalem, to touch every resident of Jerusalem, to gather them together in a redemptive way. And so we must take that as a model for us, as a pattern for us in terms of guiding our touch, our forms of touch. If there's redemption that needs to be made, our desires must be toward redemption, redemptive purposes and goals, aims, and ends.
The power of the Most High shall overshadow you. Now that is an instance in the New Testament that this kind of thing we're talking about is how our salvation occurred, transcends sex as we know it.
Well, thank you, all of you, for wonderful presentations and conversation and a very rich day today. We have a couple-hour break now, and I look forward to seeing you back here in this auditorium at 7:30 for Dr. Janet Soskis's lecture this evening.